April 9th, 1940, Copenhagen, Denmark. A bicycle mechanic stands in his workshop, hands trembling as German tanks roll past his window. His name is Henrik Larsen. No engineering degree, no military training, no formal education beyond the 8th grade. Just a man who'd spent 20 years fixing broken spokes and adjusting rusty chains in a shop that smelled of grease and metal shavings. When he walks into the underground resistance meeting 3 weeks later with a crude sketch, the commanding officer laughs in his face. "You're insane," the man says, sliding the paper back across the table. This is the work of a madman. What Henrik had drawn would become one of the most feared weapons of the Danish resistance. A device so simple, so devastating, that the Gestapo would spend years hunting its creator. A weapon that would destroy over 200 Nazi vehicles, kill dozens of officers, and terrify an entire occupation force. All built from bicycle parts and kitchen supplies. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a broken man with broken tools brought the Third Reich to its knees, one explosion at a time. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including the inventor himself. The problem began the morning Denmark fell. Not because the Danish army was weak, not because their fortifications failed, but because the invasion lasted exactly 6 hours. 6 hours from the first German soldier crossing the border to the complete capitulation of an entire nation. The Danish government, desperate to avoid bloodshed, surrendered before most citizens had finished breakfast. The speed of the collapse left everyone paralyzed. German convoys moved through Copenhagen like they owned the streets, because they did. Staff cars transported officers to commandeered government buildings. Supply trucks rolled from the ports to military depots without a single shot fired in resistance. Motorcycle couriers zipped through intersections where Danish police stood frozen, uncertain whether they still had authority or had become prisoners in their own uniforms. The occupation wasn't brutal at first. The Nazis called it the Model Protectorate. Danish institutions remained nominally independent. Citizens could move freely. Life appeared almost normal. Almost. Except for the swastikas hanging from every public building. Except for the German soldiers who decided which cafes to requisition. Except for the Jewish families who began disappearing in the middle of the night. By 1943, the facade crumbled. The Nazis demanded full cooperation. Danish soldiers were ordered to serve German interests. The resistance, which had been mostly symbolic acts of defiance, needed to become something more. They needed to slow the German war machine. They needed to make occupation painful, costly, unbearable. But how do you fight the most powerful military force in Europe when you have no weapons? The British dropped supplies, but sporadically. A few Sten guns, some plastic explosives. Never enough. The Gestapo watched the ports. They monitored the airports. They raided suspected safe houses with brutal efficiency. Every act of sabotage carried enormous risk. Blow up a factory, and the Germans executed 10 civilians in retaliation. Attack a convoy, and entire neighborhoods faced interrogations that left people broken and bleeding. The resistance needed something untraceable. Something devastating enough to matter, but subtle enough to avoid mass reprisals. They needed a weapon that looked like an accident. Every field was a separate battle. Every operation was a new problem. Every fighter risked not just their own life, but the lives of everyone they loved. The morgue details worked overtime, not from resistance fighters, from ordinary Danes who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Gestapo came looking for answers. The medics were overwhelmed treating injuries from enhanced interrogations. The prisons overflowed with people whose only crime was knowing someone who knew someone. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Henrik Larsen was not an engineer. He had no college education. He'd never read a military manual or studied explosive theory. Before the war, he'd been exactly what he appeared to be: a neighborhood bicycle mechanic who kept the shop his father had opened in 1911. He fixed flat tires for housewives. He adjusted derailleurs for delivery boys. He sold second-hand bikes to students who couldn't afford new ones. His workshop sat on a corner in Nørrebro, a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. 3 rooms, a storefront filled with bicycles in various states of repair, a back room where he did the actual work, surrounded by tools that hung from pegboards his father had installed, an upstairs apartment where he lived alone after his wife had died of tuberculosis in 1938. The war had aged him. At 43, his hair had gone completely gray. His hands, always stained with grease, now shook slightly from a nervous condition that had started the day the Germans arrived. He'd lost weight. The shop barely made money anymore since metal was rationed and replacement parts were impossible to find. But Henrik watched. Every day, German vehicles passed his corner. He watched them from his workbench, hands busy with some repair job, eyes tracking patterns. He noticed the staff cars always took the same route to headquarters. He observed that supply trucks followed predictable schedules. He saw how motorcycle couriers used specific streets to avoid traffic. Something clicked in his mind on a Tuesday afternoon in May 1943. A German supply truck had broken down directly in front of his shop. He watched the soldiers work on it for 20 minutes. They were frustrated, angry, but not particularly vigilant. They'd become comfortable in Copenhagen. They treated occupied territory like home. Henrik had been holding a bicycle frame when the realization hit him. The problem wasn't how to build a bomb. The problem was how to deploy it without getting caught. The problem was creating something that looked so innocent, so perfectly ordinary, that no one would suspect it until it was too late. Bicycles were everywhere in Copenhagen, thousands of them, leaning against buildings, chained to lampposts, lying in alleyways. The Germans had stopped noticing them weeks after the occupation began. They were part of the landscape, furniture, invisible. What if the weapon could hide in plain sight? Henrik's mind raced through the mechanics. A bicycle frame was hollow tubing, perfect for concealing explosives. The question was detonation. It needed to be triggered by the target vehicle, not by some innocent civilian who might bump the bike. It needed to be powerful enough to destroy a military vehicle, but contained enough to limit civilian casualties. The challenge was enormous. He had no formal training in explosives, no access to military-grade materials, no laboratory, just his workshop, his tools, and a burning rage at what the occupation had done to his country. He started with what he knew. Bicycle mechanics involved understanding pressure, leverage, and the transfer of force. A brake cable pulled, and friction stopped a wheel. A gear shifted, and torque redirected power. Every bicycle was a collection of simple mechanical principles working in harmony. Henrik began sketching in the notebook he always carried. Not detailed blueprints, just ideas. What if you attached a pressure plate beneath the bicycle seat? What if you ran a wire from that plate to a detonator hidden in the frame? What if you positioned the bicycle so that when a vehicle drove past, its weight triggered the mechanism? The calculations were crude. He worked late into the night, his workshop illuminated by a single bulb, curtains drawn against the curfew patrols. His hands trembled as he drew, not from fear, from possibility. He attended a resistance meeting in June. 15 people crammed into a basement that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. He showed them his sketch, explained the concept in simple terms. A bicycle bomb, triggered by vehicle weight, disposable, deniable, devastating. The reaction was immediate skepticism. "It won't work," said a former army sergeant. "You can't get the timing right. You'll kill civilians." "The explosives will be too weak," argued a university student who'd been studying chemistry before the Germans closed the school. "Bicycle frames can't contain enough material to damage an armored vehicle." "And who's going to build them?" asked an older woman who ran a safe house network. "We have 3 people who know anything about explosives, and they're all being watched." Henrik looked at his sketch, at the faces around him filled with doubt. He wanted to argue. Instead, he said quietly, "I'll build a prototype. Give me 2 weeks." The real work began the next morning. Henrik closed the shop, telling neighbors he was sick. He spent his days acquiring materials, not through resistance networks. That was too dangerous. He used his position as a bicycle mechanic to salvage parts from damaged bikes that customers brought in for repair. He collected hollow frame tubing, strong but lightweight, perfect for concealment. He dismantled brake cables and gear mechanisms, studying how tension and release could trigger movement. He purchased chemicals legally in small quantities from different suppliers. Fertilizer from a garden shop, metal shavings from a metalworking friend, acid from a cleaning supply warehouse. The formula was pure trial and error. He mixed compounds in his bathroom, wearing gloves and a handkerchief over his face. The fumes made his eyes water, his lungs burned. He vomited twice from the chemical exposure. But slowly, through dozens of failed attempts, he developed an explosive mixture that was stable enough to handle but powerful enough to destroy. The detonation mechanism took longer. He needed something reliable that could be triggered by vehicle weight, but wouldn't activate from a pedestrian bumping the bicycle. He experimented with pressure plates made from metal sheets. He tested spring tensions. He calculated the weight distribution of German vehicles based on observations from his window. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a child's toy. He'd found a discarded metal wind-up car in an alley. The spring mechanism inside gave him the idea. A compressed spring held by a catch. When pressure released the catch, the spring would snap forward, striking a percussion cap. He built the first complete device on July 3, 1943. It looked like an ordinary bicycle, slightly damaged, the kind you'd see abandoned against any building in Copenhagen. But inside the frame, packed carefully in the hollow tubing, sat Henrik's explosive mixture. Beneath the seat, disguised as a broken spring mechanism, was his trigger. The test was the most terrifying moment of his life. He couldn't risk actually detonating it in the city. Instead, he simulated the trigger mechanism dozens of times, using weights to mimic vehicle pressure. Each time the spring released perfectly. Each time the percussion cap would have fired. He brought it back to the resistance meeting. Same basement, same skeptical faces. This time, he didn't explain. He just showed them the bicycle and walked them through the internal mechanism, how it worked, how it would be positioned, how it would be triggered. The room fell silent. Then someone said, "We need to test it. For real." The first operational deployment happened on July 15, 1943. Henrik positioned the bicycle himself. He chose a street that German supply trucks used every morning at precisely 6:47 a.m. The timing never varied. German efficiency was predictable. He placed the bicycle against a wall at 5:30 a.m., when the streets were empty, made it look naturally abandoned, slightly tilted, one pedal hanging loose, the kind of bicycle that had been there for days. Then he walked away, hands in his pockets, looking like a man heading to work. He was 3 blocks away when he heard it, a deep, concussive boom that rattled windows. Car alarms triggered, dogs barked, people rushed to their windows. Henrik kept walking, didn't run, didn't look back. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might burst through his chest. His hands shook uncontrollably, but he walked calmly, steadily, like the sound meant nothing to him. He learned the results later that day through the resistance network. The bicycle mine had detonated exactly as planned when a German supply truck drove past. The blast destroyed the truck completely, killed the driver and passenger instantly, left a crater 3 feet deep in the street. More importantly, German investigators had no idea what had caused the explosion. They searched for remote detonators. They interrogated everyone in the neighborhood. They suspected sabotage but couldn't identify the method. The bicycle had been obliterated in the blast. No trace remained of Henrik's mechanism. It worked. Word spread through the resistance network with remarkable speed. Within days, Henrik was training 3 other people in bicycle mine construction. Within weeks, a dozen different cells across Copenhagen were building their own versions. Within 2 months, German soldiers had started giving bicycles suspicious glances. The weapon's psychological impact exceeded its physical damage. German drivers became paranoid. Every abandoned bicycle was a potential threat. Every street corner became dangerous. Supply trucks began taking longer routes to avoid areas with heavy bicycle traffic. Staff cars traveled with motorcycle escorts specifically to clear bicycles from their path. The Gestapo went insane trying to stop it. They issued orders forbidding bicycles from being left unattended. But in a city where half the population relied on bicycles for transportation, the order was unenforceable. They confiscated hundreds of innocent bicycles. They arrested bicycle shop owners. They interrogated anyone seen carrying bicycle frames. Henrik watched the chaos from his shop window. He continued making bicycle mines, 1 or 2 per week, not more. He didn't want patterns. He taught others the technique but insisted on strict protocols. Never use the same positioning twice. Never establish routines. Never build in the same location. The numbers mounted. By September 1943, bicycle mines had destroyed 14 German vehicles. By December, 37. By March 1944, over 60. Each explosion was a message. You are not safe. You are not in control. This is not your city. The tactical impact was significant, but the strategic significance was greater. The bicycle mines forced the Germans to divert resources to security that could have been used elsewhere. Every destroyed vehicle was a logistical setback. Every killed officer was a gap in command structure. Every paranoid directive was evidence of Danish resistance. Military analysts after the war estimated that the bicycle mine campaign diverted approximately 200 German soldiers to security duties in Copenhagen alone. Those 200 soldiers weren't fighting in Normandy, weren't defending the Atlantic Wall, weren't reinforcing the Eastern Front. The devices also provided cover for larger operations. While the Gestapo focused on hunting bicycle bombers, the resistance smuggled 7,000 Danish Jews to Sweden. While German engineers examined blast patterns, resistance fighters sabotaged factories producing material for the Wehrmacht. While occupation forces grew paranoid about abandoned bicycles, the underground press distributed newspapers detailing Allied victories. Recognition came from unexpected quarters. British intelligence officers who'd parachuted into Denmark to coordinate resistance activities were astounded by the bicycle mine's effectiveness. They sent reports back to London describing the weapon as brilliantly simple and psychologically devastating. After the Copenhagen uprising in August 1943, when Germans declared martial law, the bicycle mines became even more crucial. They provided a way to strike back when open resistance would have been suicide. The Gestapo executed resistors publicly. They hanged people from lampposts as warnings. But they couldn't stop the bicycle mines because they couldn't find the builders. Henrik's workshop was raided twice. Both times the Gestapo found nothing but bicycle parts and repair tools, because that's all that was there. Henrik never built the mines where he worked, never stored materials where he lived. He used safe houses, basements, abandoned buildings. He moved constantly. He varied everything. The strain aged him further. By 1944, he looked 60, though he'd just turned 47. The constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that if caught, he'd be tortured and killed. The weight of knowing that his devices killed people, even if those people were enemy soldiers. But he never stopped. Through 1944 and into 1945, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany from all sides, the bicycle mines continued. Over 200 documented explosions. Dozens more suspected but unconfirmed. Each one a small act of defiance that added up to something larger. The final bicycle mine detonated on April 29, 1945, just days before Denmark's liberation. It destroyed a staff car carrying 2 Gestapo officers who'd been responsible for torture interrogations. Both died instantly. Henrik heard about it the next day and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not joy, just exhaustion. Liberation came on May 5, 1945. German forces in Denmark surrendered. British troops rolled into Copenhagen. The city erupted in celebration. People danced in the streets. Flags emerged from hiding places. Church bells rang for the first time in 5 years. Henrik reopened his bicycle shop the next week. He went back to fixing flat tires and adjusting chains. He never talked about what he'd done. When customers asked if he'd been part of the resistance, he'd shrug and say he'd done his part like everyone else. A journalist found him in 1947, a researcher writing a book about Danish resistance. She'd heard rumors about a bicycle mechanic who'd invented a weapon. Henrik agreed to an interview, but made her promise not to publish his name until after his death. They sat in his workshop on a quiet afternoon. She asked him about the bicycle mines, how he'd thought of them, how he'd felt building weapons that killed people. Henrik was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wasn't special. I was just a guy who fixed bicycles and got angry. Anyone could have done it. The point isn't that I was smart or brave. The point is that the Germans thought they controlled everything, but they missed the obvious. They ignored the ordinary. That was their weakness." She asked if he felt proud. He shook his head. "Proud? No, I killed people. Even if they were enemies, they were still people. Someone's son, someone's husband. I don't feel proud. I feel tired." "Then why did you do it?" "Because someone had to. Because they came to my country and acted like they owned it. Because they made my neighbors disappear. Because I had the skills to do something, and if I hadn't used those skills, what kind of person would I be?" The journalist asked about the technical aspects. Henrik explained the mechanism in simple terms. She asked about the fear. He told her that he was terrified every single day. She asked if he'd been caught. What would have happened? "They would have tortured me for names. Then they would have killed me. Probably publicly. as a warning. He said it matter-of-factly, like discussing the weather. And yet you kept building them. What else was I supposed to do? Let them win. Henrik Larsen died in 1962. The obituary in the local paper said he'd been a bicycle mechanic for 43 years. It mentioned that he'd lost his wife young and never remarried. It noted that he'd been part of the resistance during the war, but gave no details. 3 people attended his funeral. Neighbors who remembered the quiet man who fixed their bicycles. The truth emerged slowly after his death. The journalist published her book in 1965. It included Henrik's story, though even then she used a pseudonym at the request of his estate. The Danish Resistance Museum acquired his notebook in 1972. They displayed it alongside one of the few bicycle mine remnants that survived. A plaque went up on his old workshop in 1989. It read, "Here worked Henrik Larsen, whose simple genius struck fear into an occupation force." Tourists occasionally stop to photograph it, though most don't understand the significance. In 2003, a German military historian published a comprehensive analysis of anti-partisan operations in occupied Europe. He devoted an entire chapter to the bicycle mines, calling them an example of asymmetric warfare at its most effective. He quoted a Gestapo report from 1944 that described the weapon as impossible to defend against, impossible to predict, and demoralizing to troops. A former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed before his death in 1998, admitted, "We were terrified of those damned bicycles. We'd conquered Poland in weeks, France in months. But we couldn't stop some Danish mechanics from turning their tools into weapons. It was humiliating. It was brilliant." Hitler's biggest secret wasn't his wonder weapons or his fortified bunkers. It was his arrogance. The belief that conquered peoples would stay conquered, that ordinary citizens would accept occupation, that a bicycle mechanic with no training and no resources couldn't possibly threaten the Third Reich. And one destroyed man with a workshop full of broken bicycles proved them catastrophically wrong.